I was on high, poking fun at all the excesses of the rulers and the fruit of their error and conceit. I was laughing at their ignorance. Those are supposed to be the words of Jesus, not from Matthew, not from Mark, not from Luke or John, from a text written sometime in the 2nd century, buried in the Egyptian desert for 1600 years, and dug up by a farmer in 1945. In this text, Jesus is speaking in the first person about his own crucifixion. And he is laughing, not weeping, not crying out to God, laughing, because according to this text, he was never on the cross at all. Someone else was. Someone else bore the nails, the thorns, the spear. And Jesus stood nearby, watching, mocking the people who thought they had killed him. I need to say that again because the first time I read it, I wasn't sure I was reading it right. According to this ancient Christian text, Jesus did not die on the cross. Another man was substituted in his place. And Jesus laughed. Now, before you close this video, before you decide I've lost my mind or that I'm attacking your faith, I need you to understand something. This is not a fringe internet conspiracy. This is not something someone made up last year. This belief that Jesus was not the one who died on the cross existed within 90 years of the crucifixion itself. It was taught by one of the earliest Christian teachers in the ancient world. It was recorded in at least 2 independent texts that survived the centuries. A bishop in what is now France wrote an entire 5-volume work specifically to combat it because it was spreading. And the belief that the church spent centuries trying to destroy is today held by 1.8 billion people on this planet. The most central event in all of Christianity, the crucifixion and death of Jesus, and the first generations of Christians could not agree on whether it actually happened. Stay with me on this. Around 120 AD in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, a man named Basilides was teaching. Alexandria was not a backwater. It was one of the intellectual capitals of the ancient world. The great library had been there. Greek philosophy had flourished there. Jewish scholarship thrived there. And in the decades following Jesus' death, Alexandria became one of the most important centers of early Christian thought. Basilides was one of the first Christian thinkers to develop a systematic theology. He lived roughly 1 generation, removed from the people who had known the apostles personally. We are talking about a man who was closer in time to Jesus than we are to the American Civil War. He was not a medieval heretic working from corrupted sources. He was an early Christian teacher working within living memory of the movement's origins. And according to Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon in what is now France, Basilides taught something that would have made any Orthodox Christian's blood run cold. He taught that at the crucifixion, Jesus switched forms with Simon of Cyrene. Simon, the man the Gospels say was pulled from the crowd to carry the cross, was transformed to look like Jesus and nailed to the wood in his place. Jesus, meanwhile, took the form of Simon, stood in the crowd, and watched, and laughed. He laughed at them because they could not perceive what had actually happened. Now here is where it gets complicated. Irenaeus wrote this around 180 AD, roughly 60 years after Basilides taught. His purpose was not neutral. He was writing a book called Against Heresies, and his explicit goal was to catalogue and refute beliefs he considered dangerous. So he had every reason to present Basilides in the worst possible light, to make the teaching sound as shocking and blasphemous as possible. But 2 other church fathers, Clement of Alexandria and Hippolytus of Rome, also wrote about Basilides. And they denied that Basilides taught the substitution at all. They attributed different teachings to him, which means the earliest authorities on Basilides, the men who had access to his writings and his students, could not agree on what he actually said. Think about what that tells you. The church fathers themselves, the men the Orthodox tradition holds up as defenders of the true faith, contradicted each other about what one of the earliest Christian teachers believed about the crucifixion. If they couldn't get the story straight about a man who lived 1 generation after the apostles, what does that tell you about the reliability of any single account? What is undeniable is this. By 180 AD, the belief that someone else died in Jesus' place was widespread enough that a bishop in Lyon, more than 1,000 miles from Alexandria, felt compelled to write 5 volumes against it. You don't write 5 books to refute something nobody believes. The scale of the response tells you the scale of the threat. In December of 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Zaman was digging for sabak, a soft soil used as fertilizer, at the base of a cliff. His mattock struck something hard. He dug around it and found a sealed clay jar about 3 feet tall. He hesitated before breaking it open. Later, he said he feared there might be a jinn inside, but he also thought there might be gold. He cracked the lid. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices, papyrus manuscripts, handwritten in Coptic, sealed and preserved for roughly 1600 years. Among those codices was one labeled by scholars as Codex 7. And in Codex 7, right next to each other, were 2 texts that tell the same impossible story. 2 texts, different authors, different literary styles, different theological frameworks, but the same core claim. Jesus did not die on the cross. Someone else did. And Jesus laughed. The first is called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth. Scholars date it to somewhere between 150 and 230 AD, and it is unlike anything in the 4 Gospels you know. In this text, Jesus speaks in the first person. He narrates the crucifixion as something that happened to someone else while he watched. Listen to the words. "It was another, their father, who drank the gall and the vinegar. It was not I, they were striking me with the scourge, but it was another, Simon, who bore the cross on his shoulder. It was another upon whom they placed the crown of thorns." And then this. "But I was rejoicing in the height over all the wealth of the rulers and the offspring of their error and their conceit, and I was laughing at their ignorance." And the line that stops you cold. "I did not die in reality, but in appearance." Read those words slowly. This is Jesus speaking about himself, describing the most sacred event in Christian history, and saying it did not happen to him. He says he was not the one who drank the vinegar. He was not the one who was struck. He was not the one wearing the crown of thorns. Simon bore all of it. And Jesus was above, rejoicing, laughing. The tone is not sorrowful. It is not sacrificial. It is mocking. Jesus in this text is not the suffering servant of Isaiah. He is a figure who has transcended the material world so completely that the rulers and authorities of earth could not touch him. They thought they had killed God. They had killed a substitute. And the real Jesus found it funny. Whatever you think of that theology, whatever your reaction to it, you cannot deny its power. This is not a minor variation. This is a completely different understanding of the most important event in Christian history. And it was written by people who called themselves Christians within a century or 2 of the events themselves. Right next to the Second Treatise of the Great Seth, in the same codex bound in the same leather, is another text. The Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter. Not the Apocalypse of Peter you might have heard of, the one about heaven and hell. This is a different text entirely, found only at Nag Hammadi. In this text, Peter is standing near the cross, and he sees something that terrifies him. He sees 2 figures. One is being nailed to the cross, the other is standing above the cross, looking down, glad and laughing. Peter is confused. He asks Jesus what he is seeing, and Jesus answers him, "He whom you saw on the tree, glad and laughing, this is the living Jesus. But this one into whose hands and feet they drive the nails is his fleshly part, which is the substitute being put to shame, the one who came into being in his likeness." 2 Jesuses. One on the cross, suffering, bleeding, dying. One above the cross, laughing, alive, untouched. The one who dies is described as a substitute, a fleshly copy, a likeness. The real Jesus, the living Jesus, is the one who laughs. Now I need you to hold 2 things in your mind at the same time. These are 2 different texts, written by different authors. They have different literary styles. The Second Treatise is first-person narration. The Apocalypse of Peter is a vision narrative. They use different theological vocabularies. They approach the question from different angles, and yet they tell the same story. Someone else was crucified. Jesus watched. Jesus laughed. This is not one writer's invention. When 2 independent sources, written in different communities in different styles, tell the same core story, scholars call that a tradition. It means the belief was not confined to one person's imagination. It circulated, it was taught, it was transmitted from teacher to student, community to community, generation to generation. By the time these texts were written down, The substitution story was already old enough to have developed multiple versions. That is the thing that makes this so difficult to dismiss. You can explain away one text as the work of an eccentric. You cannot explain away a tradition. Irenaeus understood the threat. Around 180 AD, he sat down and began writing what would become the 5 volumes of Against Heresies. Not a pamphlet, not a letter. 5 volumes. The sheer scale tells you how many of these alternative beliefs existed and how deeply they had taken root. He devoted entire chapters to cataloging and refuting teachers like Basilides, Valentinus, Marcion, and others who offered versions of Christianity that did not match what Irenaeus considered the true faith. His method was thorough. He would describe the heretical teaching, often in detail that is our only surviving record of what these teachers actually said, and then he would argue against it using the texts he considered authoritative. In doing so, he helped define what would eventually become the New Testament canon. The books Irenaeus defended became the books the church kept. The books he attacked became the books the church burned. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 367 AD, a bishop named Athanasius of Alexandria issued his annual Easter letter to the churches under his authority. In it, he listed 27 books that he declared canonical, the books that would become the New Testament. And he ordered that all other texts be removed from circulation and destroyed. Not debated, not preserved for future study. Destroyed. Somewhere near Nag Hammadi, someone received that order. And they decided to disobey. 13 codices, wrapped in leather, sealed in a clay jar, buried at the base of a cliff. An act of defiance that preserved, for 1600 years, the voices the church wanted silenced forever. I found the second treatise of the Great Seth on a Tuesday afternoon at the Hodges Library at the University of Tennessee. I still had borrowing privileges through a program they offered to retired educators, and I had requested a translation of the Nag Hammadi library through interlibrary loan. It arrived in a thick brown volume, the kind with library tape on the spine and someone else's pencil notes in the margins. I sat down at one of those long wooden tables on the second floor, opened to Codex 7, and started reading. When I got to the line, I was laughing at their ignorance. I closed the book and sat there. I just sat there. The library was quiet. Students were walking past, and I was sitting with a sentence that turned the crucifixion inside out. Now let me bring Spinoza into this, not as a protagonist, as a method. In chapter 6 of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Spinoza makes a claim that sounds simple, but changes everything once you take it seriously. He writes that nothing happens in nature which contradicts its universal laws. He calls miracles a sheer absurdity. He argues that every event narrated in Scripture, no matter how extraordinary it sounds, either came to pass naturally or did not happen at all. Spinoza is not attacking faith. He is proposing a way to read. He is saying, treat these texts as human documents produced by human beings in specific historical circumstances and read them accordingly. Apply that method to the crucifixion and watch what happens. Open all 4 canonical Gospels to the crucifixion scene and read them side by side. In Mark, the oldest Gospel, Jesus' last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In Luke, his last words are, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." In John, his last words are simply, "It is finished." 3 different Gospels, 3 different final sentences. The most dramatic moment in the story, the last words of the dying God, and the men who wrote it down could not agree on what he said. Who was at the tomb on Sunday morning? Mark says 3 women. Matthew says 2. Luke says at least 3, possibly more. John says 1. Mary Magdalene, alone. What did they find? Mark says a young man in a white robe. Matthew says an angel who descended from heaven and caused an earthquake. Luke says 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning. John says 2 angels seated inside the tomb. Same event. 4 accounts. 4 different versions. Spinoza would not be surprised. He would say this is exactly what you should expect when different communities in different cities at different times tell the story of the same events. Each community remembered differently, Each community shaped the story to fit its own theology, its own audience, its own needs. The proto-Orthodox communities told one version. The Gnostic communities told another. Basilides told his. The author of the second treatise told his. The author of the Apocalypse of Peter told his. None of them are dictations from heaven. All of them are human. And Spinoza would say, the truth is not in choosing one account over another. The truth is in the method. Read them as what they are. Documents produced by men and women who were trying with imperfect knowledge and powerful conviction to make sense of something that had happened to someone they loved or believed in. The disagreements are not failures. They are data. They tell you that Christianity was never one thing. It was always many things, and the version that survived was simply the version that won. Now follow the timeline, because this is where the story becomes something no one expects. Around 120 AD, Basilides teaches in Alexandria that Jesus was not the one crucified. Between 150 and 230 AD, the second treatise of the Great Seth and the Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter are written, telling the same story in different ways. Around 180 AD, Irenaeus writes 5 volumes specifically to combat these and similar beliefs, confirming that they were widespread. In 367 AD, Athanasius orders the destruction of all non-canonical texts, and someone buries 13 codices in a jar. The texts disappear from history, but the belief does not disappear. In the centuries that followed, various Christian sects in the Middle East and Arabia continued to teach versions of Christianity that differed sharply from the orthodoxy defined at the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. Some of these sects maintained the belief in the substitution at the cross. Travelers, merchants, and missionaries carried these ideas along trade routes connecting Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, and the Arabian Peninsula. And then, in the 7th century, a man in Mecca received what he believed to be a revelation from God. The Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, was compiled in the decades following the death of Muhammad in 632 AD. And in Surah 4, verse 157, it says this about Jesus. And for their saying, indeed we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of God. And they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them. They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. It was made to appear so. Scholars have long debated the origins of this verse. Some argue it reflects direct knowledge of Gnostic Christian traditions that reached Arabia through the heterodox sects that survived in the region. Others see it as an independent theological development within the Islamic tradition. But the echo is unmistakable. The same core claim that Basilides taught in Alexandria around 120 AD, that Jesus was not the one who died on the cross and that the appearance of his death was an illusion, is stated plainly in the Quran. 1.8 billion Muslims alive today hold this belief. 1.8 billion. The belief that Irenaeus tried to refute in 180 AD, that Athanasius tried to destroy in 367 AD, that was sealed in a clay jar and buried at the base of a cliff in Egypt, is today the position of the second largest religion on earth. The tradition the Church tried hardest to eradicate is the tradition that refused to die. There is a timeline here that you cannot ignore. 120 AD in Alexandria, 150 to 230 AD in Roman Egypt, 180 AD in Lyon, 367 AD in Alexandria again, 1945 in a field near Nag Hammadi, 632 and beyond in Mecca and Medina, and today in every mosque on the planet. 1900 years. The belief survived for 1900 years despite every attempt to silence it. It survived the burning of books. It survived the suppression of sects. It survived the collapse of empires and the rise of new ones. It passed from teacher to student, from community to community, from one continent to another, until it found a home in a tradition that grew to encompass nearly a quarter of the human race. I want to end with a question, not an answer. I do not have an answer. I am not sure anyone does. What does it mean that the first Christians, the people who lived within 1 or 2 generations of Jesus himself, could not agree on whether he died on the cross? I'm not talking about people in the Middle Ages. I'm not talking about modern skeptics with too much time on the internet. I'm talking about people who were closer in time to the crucifixion than any of us will ever be. People who may have spoken with people who spoke with people who were there, and they did not agree. Some said he died and rose again. Some said he died but did not physically rise. Some said he never truly had a physical body at all. Some said another man was substituted, and Jesus stood by, laughing. These were all Christian positions in the first 2 centuries. All of them claimed to have received their teaching from the apostles. All of them considered themselves faithful followers of Jesus. And the version that won, the version that became the Nicene Creed and the Catechism and the Sunday Sermon, won not because it had better evidence. It won because it had better organization. It won because a bishop in Lyon wrote 5 volumes. It won because a bishop in Alexandria issued an order. It won because the communities that held it eventually aligned with the Roman state and gained the power to enforce their version as the only version. The other versions were buried, literally, in jars in the ground in the desert, and they stayed buried for 1600 years until a farmer's mattock cracked a piece of clay and the voices came back. I think about this late at night sometimes. Not the theology, not the texts, the uncertainty of it. For 50 years I knew how Jesus died. I knew it the way I knew my own name. He was nailed to a cross. He suffered. He died. He rose. That was the story. That was the foundation. Everything else was built on that. And now I sit at this desk and I read words written by people who lived 100 years after the cross, people who were closer to it than I will ever be. And those people were not sure. They told different stories. They argued. They accused each other of heresy. They wrote books against each other. The thing I was most certain about, they were fighting over. I am not telling you Jesus did not die on the cross. I do not know what happened on that hill outside Jerusalem in roughly 30 AD. Neither do you. Neither did Basilides. Neither did Irenaeus. They were all working with fragments, stories passed down, translated, edited, shaped by the communities that carried them. Some of those fragments ended up in the Bible. Some ended up in a clay jar. Some ended up in the Quran. All of them are human attempts to make sense of something that mattered more to those people than anything else in the world. The question I cannot put down is not which version is true. The question is what it means that there were versions at all. That the event the entire Christian faith is built upon, the single moment everything depends on, was told differently by the very people who should have known. And if they did not know, if the people closest in time to the event itself could not agree on what happened, then the certainty I carried for 50 years was not mine. It was given to me by the version that won, and I held it without ever asking whether the other versions had something to say. They had something to say. They said it in Alexandria. They said it in the Egyptian desert. They said it in a jar sealed with clay. And 1600 years later, the jar broke open, and the words were still there, still laughing,